Well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this discussion about complexity and cybersecurity, a tangled web. I'm very excited to have four of the CTA board members here with me today to talk about this. We have Jaya Baloo from Rapid7 as the Chief Security Officer, Chen as the Vice President of Engineering for the Enterprise Security Group at Broadcom Symantec, Dr. Dorit Dor, the Chief Technology Officer at Checkpoint, and Mike Sikorski, the Vice President and CTO Unit 42 for Palo Alto Networks. So we're going to talk a little bit today about one of the main drivers of problems in cybersecurity, which is complexity. In fact, in many ways, we talk about complexity being the enemy of security, and that's true across multiple domains, not just cybersecurity. It's true in physical security and in other security aspects. So it's a common problem, but is one that seems to afflict cyberspace and information technology networks in particular. But first of all, we should actually, as we get going, we should actually explain what we mean by complexity, and talk a little bit about different kinds of complexity. So when we talk about complexity and security, Jaya, maybe I'll turn to you to sort of kick this one off, but what do we mean by that complexity? Complexity is the enemy of security.
Well, I think, for a very long time, we thought there was some security to be had in obscurity, in terms of making our networks large and complex and heterogeneous with all different types of technologies. And, we thought that layered defense meant that you needed 32 different kinds of well, not really 32, but lots of different types of technology in order to ensure that if one thing broke, you could rely on something else. And while to a certain extent that's true, what you see is that this complexity is killing us. Complexity is actually the enemy of security. And that means that already, we're having a hard time trying to fix the things that we know about. But the complexity is such, it's like an emergent behavior that has arisen from all of these different protocols and products and technologies. And that emergence is the thing that's really, making us struggle, I think, to figure out how to move further in order to actually make things more secure and trustworthy.
Yeah, so I mean, Dorit, from the sort of research side and sort of the thinking about IT and computer science and other things, how do you think about complexity and its relationship to cybersecurity?
So I think first that there is complexity that influence multiple stages. So there is the influence of complexity on the attacker. Actually, complexity on the attacker may open many interesting opportunities to where to come from. There is the influence on the defender. The defender, if they are unable to see a clear picture of what's going on, they have very hard time understanding if they are really defending. And there is also the complexity on the remediation. If the system is so complex, even after you kind of know exactly what to do, the remediation may be risky and taking time, etc. So on one hand, there are the different kind of stages of things where complexity kicks in. The other thing is, I think that people have the ability to understand very simple set of short, let's call them rules or elements of policy, and a deterministic systems. And one of the complexities that is growing on these days is non-deterministic stuff, especially with the AI. So that's yet another angle of complexity that I don't even know to predict what would be the outcome of something. So I think that overall, the complexity is really kind of the opposite of security in many senses, but we could give more examples as we move on.
Yeah, Mike or Joe, anything that you want to add on to sort of how, what we mean when we talk about complexity?
Complexity in my mind maps a little bit towards a risk surface. More complexity, you're introducing more risk surface to an environment, and you think about defending. It's an attacker might think about, hey, the attack can cause chaos, and for vendors, for folks on the defensive side, you're also thinking about, hey, it's a very complex environment. You have to do no harm as you deploy technology to complex environments. You not only protect, you got to make sure our technology is so entrenched into the operating system or to the network, we're not causing additional problems for a customer, right? So it's certainly adds more difficult, that's more challenge to protect something that's a large ecosystem that's now has more attack surfaces. That goes along with complexity. So it puts more challenge to us to kind of think about how we tailor and adapt to this complexity to reduce the such surface and do it such that we're not destabilized to the very thing, the ecosystem we're trying to protect.
Yeah.
And I think of complexity as sort of two things when I talk about cyber. I think there's what Joe just said, sort of like what we're up against from a risk standpoint. And you think about, we're trying to secure this internet thing we built still because we didn't think about security as we were building it, right? And then we see cloud, and we have a lot of our customers are split between cloud and not cloud. And now you have all this complexity that's been introduced by having different types of environments all within the same environment. And now we're seeing the same thing with AI, where we're rolling that out. And if we're not careful and think about it, we're going to be running up against all those same challenges that we see over and over again. So complexity from defending complex networks like that. And then you turn and I say, look at the cybersecurity industry as a whole has created a tremendous amount of complexity. And now we're having to deal with that. We've created a lot of great products that can detect attacks. But when you throw them all together, it's so many alerts at once, so many things. And now there's technologies coming out to say, how can I sift through all that and make sense of all the noise that we've created for ourselves? So there's a tremendous amount of complexity that you have to sift through just as a defender with products that are actually pretty good at detecting attacks.
Yeah, and I think, when I also think about, complexity, there's also, and I think several of you referenced this, there's the link to sort of chaotic systems. And Dorit, you were talking about this in particular, that sort of by their very nature, a lot of this is non-deterministic, right? That the internet itself, cyberspace itself, is a complex, chaotic environment, sort of in the mathematical definitions of those in those terms. And humans aren't very good at dealing with that. And so I think this, leads to, sort of an interesting question about sort of two questions here that I'll kind of link together is, we've been hinting at this, and Dorit, you were particular, but I want to pull the thread on this a little bit. Why is complexity the enemy of, security? Why is that? And why does it seem like we are incapable of reducing the complexity in our IT systems or in the cybersecurity industry even? What is sort of driving those two factors? And so anybody that wants to kind of get in on that first question about sort of why complexity is bedevils security so much.
I could try to kind of refer to this. I think that as defenders, we're trying to build an architecture for security around the things we have, around what are important assets, around how they connect to each other and how they influence each other. If they are connected or influencing or related in an unclear way, or we are unable to capture all the things we have inside, we will have very hard time designing an architecture around it that secures it. If we take the cloud, the addition of the cloud added many hidden connections. So maybe on a trigger of event, now there is a connectivity between point A and point B that was not defined anywhere and was not seen anywhere and is actually temporal. And as a defender, I don't know that it even exists. So it's not very easy to see the stuff that is on, the connection between the things that are on, and am I kind of protected if I combine all my protection points to my kind of entities. And I think that it's very fundamental for security to be designed in and not to be on top. So not to be an after fact, okay, here's something that happened and I need to respond, but to be designed in. And the design in is complex when the system is complicated or when we as humans don't understand the interaction between elements.
If
Yeah,
I could add to that,
no, go ahead, Brittany.
yeah, so I actually think like, and we've been kind of alluding and walking around this, but like the only constant thing, and you guys have all talked about this, is the change that we've seen in our industry from the fact that we've built this kind of slightly wonky internet that wasn't thinking about security. We keep adding to it, and that dynamism doesn't actually help us understand it better. And I think specifically of all of the folks that I've spoken to who really like struggle just documenting, mapping, understanding their own networks and systems and assets and protocols, much less, like when they integrate other folks' stuff and they're also responsible for like vendor management and third-party risk. And like, how do you do that? And then there's new technologies that come on top of that. So I think there is a like not linear but exponential expansion that we're looking at in the types of things that they need to not only defend but just foundationally understand. And if we cannot foundationally understand these things and understand the interrelationship of those things, or do a document change every time there's a configuration update, I think that foundational problem, this premise of I have no clue what I have anymore, I don't know where it's coming from, and yes, I have tools that can scan it, but is that a complete picture of the truth? I don't know. What percentage is it of all of, like, for example, the vulnerabilities I may have across my network? I don't know. So I find that when you talk to customers and they have those kinds of responses, like how more difficult can we make it for them? How can they possibly defend something that like we haven't given them the tools to effectively understand at scale?
Well, and then, you've also got the challenge of in many organizations, there's what's officially on the books, right? And then there's all the other what we call shadow IT, where, Sally has hooked up some device somewhere to the network, or, Fitzroy has, added this other capability over here that they didn't bother telling anybody about, right? Maybe because they forgot about it, or maybe because they actually didn't want anybody else to tell them no, right? So that just makes it even more, even more complicated. But I also think there's this issue of, when these systems, right, the complexity leaves holes, right? It's very hard to find all of the holes and plug them, even down to like literally the software itself is, we always find new vulnerability. People are always finding new vulnerabilities in software. And why is that? Because the software has functionality that you don't even know is there. And I say functionality, meaning it can be made to do things that you didn't even know it could be made to do. And that's a big driver of innovation, but it's also a big driver behind, enabling the bad guys to do things that you never anticipated. And I think that, that contributes a lot to why complexity is so difficult to manage for defenders.
Yeah.
And some of what we've been talking about, like, Mike, you were talking about the move to the cloud and other things, and how that's, an AI, and how that's going to contribute to the growth in complexity. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. So I don't know what your thinking on that is.
Well, I think it's sort of like, is AI going to help or hurt here? When you talk about complexity, I'll take the stance that it's gonna make things rough for us as cyber defenders, because I think people are rushing to get this stuff out as fast as they can, be the first on market to have their AI assistant out or whatever it might be, and then they're not thinking things through, and then they're allowing things to connect into different databases they have, and it's these agents that are just being plumbed up without really thought of like, well, what else could it access if it has access to that thing? And could it be, manipulated in a certain way such to get information out that they don't want to be exposing? And I don't know that, everybody's taking every single step along the way to say, what kind of risks am I exposing here? Instead, they're looking at other things. And this is a constant thing we struggle with in security is your business value of what you want to do versus the security risk, right? And if your company exists only because of what it's building in this space, maybe security is kind of an afterthought for you. And so I think it's going to create a tremendous amount of problems. And I think shadow IT, people talk about more with the cloud, there's going to be an equivalent with AI such that, you know, not thinking through how these agents are connecting out and having properly security around each and every single one of them is going to be a huge explosion of problem, especially when you start to think about AI that can spin up other AI to be able to connect to the things it needs to do to make decisions.
Yeah. And you just sort of, I almost have this vision of like the AI, responding to somebody from the outside and spitting out all sorts of, confidential information and other things. And, the owner saying, well, why didn't you tell us you were doing that? And the AI saying, because you never asked, right? It's sort of you just didn't ask the question the right way. And, so yeah, I mean, I think the complexity is growing fast, but I think that's part of it is that that the business drivers of it. But I also think there's the nature of the internet itself, right? The benefits from a connected system grow as there's more things connected to the system, right? So there's kind of an inherent bias towards increasing in a network, right? There's a bias towards increasing the scope and scale of the network. But
I think that one of the reasons it will go up is that we gave few examples and we could give more, where actually intention to do some things that are simpler are also adding to the complexity from the point of view of the defender. So there are many like open source packages that would pull off other open source packages by transition. And it was only built so that it would be easier for developer to kind of contain all the code that they need without coding too much. But that by itself creates a lot of complexity by bringing a lot of open source inside. Or some of the simplifications that were done in the cloud, where you can call up triggers on events or certain behaviors or something of that nature. And that was done to simplify the life of the operators of the cloud. But then for a defender that looks at the problem, it creates a completely ambiguous system that they don't know to preclude what would happen. Or the non-deterministic nature that was coming in order to bring better answers actually create complexity. So one of the problems with security is that oftentimes everything good that is trying to be done also bring a level of complexity into security. This is why I don't think it would be reduced, because people are going to continue and drive for simplicity in other KPIs, and that would add to the complexity that the defenders have.
Well,
I think there's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
yeah, look, it wasn't to be true as for financial, for business, there's a lot of incentive to continue to innovate. I mean, that's the world, and that's what drives all this new innovation development that will continue to thrive. And then you plot onto time domain. You look at what's happening over the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. It's you see some of the solutions are built very elegantly. Like that's still part of transacting the world's financial transactions today. I mean, they don't necessarily need to have all this complexity. So one proposal, one way might be looking at thinking about is really partition the problem such that you still allow that innovation and kind of this new things to come to market and be able to get tested. And also on the opposite side is, look, lockdown seems to work. You have special purpose machines, special purpose transaction items, and let it do what it does and nothing else, and minimize its risk surface to a minimal. Anything that looks different from that, don't let it be. So I think it's complexity and also the be able to extract elegance and that core function and the market and the product and all that, it helps us transform the problem into a more solvable one. And that could be a playbook, but we continue to evolve, whether it's AI tomorrow or something else that's waiting on web. And we haven't had maybe AI will come, will help us dream the next thing that after AI, and let our playbook be very consistent to simplify the challenge.
What I find difficult though, so I totally agree with that notion of if you know that it's there, lock it down. But what I find difficult in this space, and specifically today, is that you may have, for example, used a particular tool or a like a subcomponent of a tool with a certain understanding of what it does and how it works and which technologies it's using and where it's sending the data, et cetera, et cetera. But like I talk to CISOs where one of the biggest challenges now is all of the vendors they may have initially onboarded with like supplier security and privacy annexes and the whole shebang, like that is now no longer as worthy as it was when they first created it because those companies have seamlessly and in the background adopted AI mechanisms, but they haven't necessarily gone out and told all of their customers, by the way, we're actually using, name your AI flavor model, et cetera, in the background. We're actually using that on all of your data. And they haven't done that. And they've just embedded it into product. And these customers now, like, I think the way that they've architected it would require like a significant scope change in order to kind of, to your point, lock it down. So I find it, I think like I think it's actually really difficult, like, I mean, we saw the couple of things that happened. I won't name and shame those vendors, but you know who I'm talking about, where they already integrated the use of AI and didn't go out and tell customers and then had to pull it back, like I see a lot of that happening and I don't see CISOs having that playbook in an easy way to accommodate that scope change.
The economies of that, I hopefully will drive the market where CISO will say prior to certain purchase decision, these questions has to be asked and allow the market to be more mature. And some of that, you look at some of these, stuff out of government space. I think you start to see those questions being asked, and the more mature vendors, you do see consideration along with all the privacy and such being part of the consideration, right? I think I'm hoping that's actually maybe a way to drive some of these differentiation with maturity versus kind of like just a feature, yet another booth at RSA type of approach. So
Well, it sounds like all of you are just talking about supply chain essentially, right? And I think that is a huge complexity that people are bringing in stuff to their network left and right with update packages they don't know about. And there's not that incentive to make your software less complex so it has less vulnerabilities, less complex so it's not introducing all this code that you don't even really need to be there, and make it simple just to do the task that you bought that software for. Instead, it just keeps getting more and more bloated and it's riddled with problems. And that's why we've seen, vulnerabilities be leveraged at a scale that it just keeps going up and up, right? Like phishing was the number one way people were getting, at least in the IRs we were responding to, and now it's vulnerabilities, right? And the ability to scan across just huge amounts of network data really quickly is newer as far as the ability to do that, compromise somebody, get in, and then with ransomware, they can move very quickly to monetize. So I think it's like when I actually too, I think you can't not talk about the supply chain and the fact that you're never going to be able to vet your supply chain in the right manner. It's really, really hard. Like Joe, you mentioned questionnaires. That's really that's going to get you so far. You're not going to vet every line of code for everything you're installing in your network. Forget about it, right? It's like even scanning the packages is almost it's like a waste of time, right? With how people can embed stuff in there. So like that inherent complexity, it just creates such a tremendous amount of risk. So you have to think about how to defend against that, and it's pretty daunting.
Yeah, and I think there are, part of our issue here in sort of the software space, right, is we lack some we lack experience with, I mean, like if you're a car manufacturer, right, and you're sourcing parts from all over the world, you can test those parts when they come in, right? And like defects in the manufacturing process or vulnerabilities in the manufacturing process of your supplier don't really matter for that part. Like the part doesn't carry the vulnerability with it, right? Now, if it doesn't meet quality specs and other things, you could get yourself in trouble that way. But like you can test for that much more easily. And I think part of what you're getting at there, Mike, is that you know it's like that entire part carries every aspect of the manufacturer's defects and their individual proclivities, and that's true in software in a way that it's not with a physical widget, if you will.
Yeah, one of the problems of complexity is infrastructure, and infrastructure that is not like the supply chain, but the basis of the infrastructure of the cloud that has connectivity between stuff that is not necessarily easily visible, or the infrastructure of IPv6 and IPv4 and different protocols plugged in, or the need to get to a DNS with all its kind of edge cases that would create. So some of the complexity is not just in the supply chain, it's also in the bones. And when I go to the bones, you talked about hardware. One of the challenges is that more and more of the components that used to be hardware are now software. Even cars are kind of a mobile on a wheel. So now all these infrastructures that maybe have been hardware at once and were easily testable, they are also software with a supply chain and with all the complexity, and they change every 2 minutes and stuff like this. So I think that the problem is that there is not much more kind of these hardware pieces that you envision. And kind of software is everywhere, including in the infrastructure, including in the networking, like routing based on software, finding kind of where the route goes. So very fundamental things in your infrastructure are in a combination of non-deterministics or complex to understand.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. When you talk about like software-defined networking, you know, that's a very different kind of environment than what I think most people, think of, right? It's now you're kind of in a Doctor Strange universe where like the streets and buildings can literally sort of change on you as you're going along, as opposed to being fixed in space and time. So I think that's a very different type of environment to live in. Jay, I want to pull back on a thread that you were talking about earlier about the way that the cybersecurity industry itself has, contributed to this problem. But also to kind of turn it around of, are there ways that we can start, at least reducing our contribution to the problem, and how do we do that?
Yeah, so I think like one of the biggest things that you're seeing, right, as I think that you see it almost as a natural phenomenon, is that you see some sort of consolidation, where a few years ago it was like the next acronym that a CISO doesn't have, they need to get that thing too, and let's rename something that we've actually been doing and using for decades and just call it a new acronym and let an analyst tout it. And then subsequently, like, we'll create this market demand. And I think what you're seeing is actually a lot of that is just noise that is, kind of a way to sell product. And that, we see that it's actually contributing to a lot of apathy with customers who feel like they genuinely don't know what to do anymore and they can't keep buying things. So they're beginning to do one of two things. Either they're rationalizing their environment of their security products. So not trying to have 50, but trying to have 3, or trying to look and make like better choices between, where we had choices between best of breed versus best of suite. So what should we do? Should we get like the best little, siloed thing and then have 45 of them? Or should we do something that's best of suite that has a holistic view and like what we've been talking about for ages, for a single pane of glass, all of that good stuff. And I think that consolidation is inevitable. Purely from the fact that it's just one more vendor supply chain headache, to Mike's point. It's like, and we don't want those. And like even in our own environment, I am like being so thoughtful before we add a single thing, before we're guilty of the same thing that we accuse other departments of. I don't want our security department doing that. So that's going to change.
The other thing that the industry could do is move more onto standards and to, let's call them documented standards. So the benefit of having AI is that it could really read your documentation and kind of act on it in different way. Explain to you what you see, explain the relations between entities, kind of find out what is the current status. You could do a lot of things if you have kind of an interface that is programmatic in many senses, could be documented and textual, but still understood by a system in a structured way. And even if we don't all have exactly the same API, but if it's all very structured in being documented, then AI could actually end up helping us understand where we are. If everybody has kind of setters and getters, and you could kind of get the picture of your environment and set stuff. The problem always with this kind of imaginary scenario is that we are always stuck with the problem that we never retired anything. So anything that was there 30 years ago still is there today because somebody is still using this in a backward compatibility mode. So I'm very much in favor of this kind of standardization. The only problem is that there are all these things that don't comply because they are there for ages. I'm just trying to just counter myself.
No, and I mean, I think you see that all the time. We dealt with this in the government, when I was in the US government, we dealt with this problem continuously because every incentive in the government structure is to keep stuff around for as long as possible. And so that's how you end up with, agencies that are running, modern apps on top of, early 2000s operating systems on top of, 1980s hardware. Right. And those environments are even more complex because of all the different, aspects there. I mean, I think the other piece, you're right, though, Dorit. I think, the more that we can push towards standardization, the more that we can push towards interoperability. I think that there's going to be a considerable push towards enabling different products and things to talk to each other is going to be really large. And I want to push on this a little bit because the other piece that I didn't think about as much in the questions that we were talking about before this, but there's a danger of going in the other direction, right? Because we refer to it as concentration risk, and you actually are seeing this now in like the idea of a monoculture. And Jay, I'll go back all the way to something you said at the beginning, right? Which was that there was this idea that you didn't actually want to have a monoculture, right? That you wanted some diversity in there, and there's some truth to that, right? That if everybody is on exactly the same thing, and you have that concentration risk, that also poses a risk to networks as well. And so I started thinking about sort of, is there actually this trade-off between sort of concentration risk and complexity risk? And so how do you sort of navigate, between those? And is what we're really talking about you want enough complexity, but not too much? Like, is that a thing?
Yeah, so I think this is fascinating. You like Dory just mentioned AI could solve some of this. I actually think one of the things that's the most interesting from an AI perspective to solve is exactly this interoperability area because like let's be honest, right? Everybody has tech debt. Like even the folks on this, we all have some tech debt and we all have to deal with our legacy tech debt while we adopt new technologies, mitigate, all of the potential threats that are happening in the middle, have this view of that holistic tech stack and like be able to do that. In order to do that from the old stuff to the new stuff, that better be able to talk to each other. And I see there like genuinely from this notion of creating sort of API interfaces, I see there like a huge benefit to thinking about how LLM specifically could help do that, have a cross-funneling of data. And that could mean that you have a translation layer between some of those things that we would consider legacy tech debt to the newer adoption stuff that we could theoretically make more secure old stuff and use it as a sort of secure layer over some of this other stuff. I think that is definitely a thing, but to Michael's point, even that would be potentially a single point of failure if that middleware layer would would break. So I think, how do we create an understanding of our interdependencies that we do not have all the airlines going down because they're dependent on a single vendor? And I'm not talking about anyone in particular, even though it sounds like I am. You guys know where I'm going. I'm just saying, how do we at least notionally understand interdependencies enough to be able to mitigate them by allowing this openness and this
We
interconnectedness?
should all have one airline that runs Windows 3.1.
Right. Just airline. Right. Yeah. Joe, you look like you want to get in on this.
No, I didn't want to get in on that. That's fine.
Mike, any sort of thoughts, that balance between concentration risk and complexity risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't necessarily have to make things complex to make them more secure, right? I think staying away from that is a good thing. Like, I see a lot of environments I go into and we're responding to an incident response where you go in, or like, why do you let your users do all of this stuff, install whatever they want, connect to, like, they're just, and this is, in tech, yeah, people have all these things they need to install, and they're developers, they kind of go do what they do. But in a lot of environments we go into, it's the same thing, that computer has one job. That's what the user should be doing. It should be easier to lock these things down and reduce the complexity and clutter on those to a degree. And then the defense in depth that you're focused on that machine is it acting up from doing the one thing it's supposed to do? But when we let people do whatever they want, things get out of control, and it makes that introduction of complexity, while you think it might be helping having a lot of different security products, it doesn't actually move the needle in your defense posture, right?
It's like seeing some sort of cascading daisy chain scripting, calling each other out of your finance department's laptop. That's a little different. So that should really jump out at folks.
I wanted to add, sorry.
And look, just like adding, just conceptually, I kind of, it's kind of many things in life. It's just having that transparency, having that measurement tend to promote a certain right or set of behavior that's for folks to see. And it's whether a supply chain or large scale deployment, it will be really nice. Like, one thing will be mandated such that all software applications should really declare, what do you intend to do? What do you do? What servers are the three things I need to talk to be able to sustain, be able to update, be able to whatever that might be. And beyond that, like, hey, block me from hurting myself. So from you can declare that on day one. So when you declare into a bank or into an airline, if I'm doing the fourth thing, we were compromised. Block me. Additional transparency, and it's the next level kind of locking down, but that also involves the suppliers, the application developers, in collaboration with the customers that actually deploy the use cases. Then you drive it from both sides, and cannot just do it from one side. And drive from both sides. Now you declare the transparency, and now all of a sudden, I think we can further reduce complexity significantly.
Yeah, Dorit?
Yeah, I wanted to add one more piece of complexity that is actually created sometimes with security products by security personnel. And that is that we lack the ability to define a generic policy. And so we end up solving the problem by exceptions. So I felt that it was unjustified. We will finish the call without mentioning the word exceptions. And then we have a gazillion of exceptions that we don't know how to manage them or where to find them. So we sometimes create the complexity as defenders because we don't want to go to the deep change and kind of make a real policy change because we are afraid it will influence some undesired influences. And so we manage by exceptions. And that's kind of complicated.
Dorit, I love this because I actually think that one of our problems is we try to make, especially in tech, right? We try to make security a process driven with a degree of democracy. So finance or a project or someone else will say, to your point on the exception, I accept the risk. Let's have an exception here. And I actually think this is exactly the opposite of what we need to drive that complexity down. You don't need democracy, you need friendly dictatorship. So you need a security team that just says no, that says you have, if you have an exception, you better have a darn good reason. You need to already show me a mitigation. Otherwise, no exceptions, just get it done. Or if you're, for whatever reason, you're, a dependent software library vendor, blah, 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 can't do the getting it done part of remediating that vulnerability or problem or whatever architecture stack, then they need to leave. And those are hard, difficult decisions best made by those friendly dictators.
Yeah, it's an interesting, certainly, again, drawing on my experience in the federal government and in the US federal government and trying to get, increased security is that every agency is a special snowflake, right? And every single bureau within every agency is a special, unique case with their own particular needs. And part of our problem there, Jay, I'll take it in a little bit different direction, is that a lot of times what we've done is I used to call it sort of, we've electronically just paved the cow paths, right? We took the old processes and just digitized them rather than actually spend the time to think about, well, if we did it a different way, we wouldn't even need all of this stuff, right? You could just do it a different way. And some of that's human nature, right? Some of that is the way that humans interact with the technology. And I think from a business standpoint, you're right that, some of the discussions that we need to have are, yeah, great. That's great that you're accepting that you want to accept that risk, but because you're increasing your risk is increasing my risk, right? Collectively, is that where we want to be? Because that, again, drawing on the point that Dorit was making, all of these risks actually, they sum to more than the linear addition, right? They compound and interact in a way that increases the risk much more than linearly. So I think that's another consideration. We're just about sort of at time for this discussion. So I'm going to kind of go around and just ask for everybody, so your last thoughts on what are the key things that you could be doing, and if you're a system owner, what are the key things you could be doing to reduce your risk, or if you want to take it from a cybersecurity vendor standpoint, or to reduce your complexity and thereby your risk, to Joe's point. Or if you're a vendor, what should we be doing to help drive down complexity in the system? And maybe I'll go in kind of reverse order from where I started. So Mike, I'm gonna start with you on this one.
Yeah, no, so I think when I think about complexity, at least going into this conversation, I was thinking immediately about the complexity in the cybersecurity industry of what we've created almost for ourselves, as far as the amount of alerts, the amount of stuff we're having people sift through, and it becoming an impossible task for them to overcome. And so I think thinking about that, if I'm a vendor or if I'm a CISO, is how do I get that reduction down? Maybe some of the compatibility stuff we just discussed would be awesome. I also think about threat intelligence and like how we all have different names for everything. We all assess risks and threats as different things, like speaking more of a common language on some of those. Obviously, we've had great things over the years, like MITRE ATT&CK and a lot of other things where we started to make good progress on that front and speaking the same language. But I think the more we do that as vendors, which I think is a huge part of this Cyber Threat Alliance, is learning about each other and how we can actually interact and share better. has been highly beneficial for me seeing how this world of complexity is evolving. And so, yeah, that's sort of one area that comes to mind. And then the other is AI. And just thinking about if I'm a CISO right now, like what is my plan? What is my playbook? What am I pushing on to my chief product officer and others to make sure that this isn't going to be an explosion event for the company, right? Where we just because we didn't think it through, we now opened up such a tremendous risk that it puts the company at risk. And I think that that would be something that would be super top of mind of how am I going to secure that as we go, but in a way that is not going to stifle the innovation or make it seem like, oh, security here is here just to end everything. So I'm going to go do it on the side by myself. That's exactly what you don't want to have happen. So you really have to be a partner in the right way to make sure that they actually are following the rules and they're just not going to go off and innovate something separately, which would defeat the whole purpose of the security you're putting out.
Okay. Yep. Dorit?
Yeah, I think a combination of structural definition of stuff. So giving a room to define the architecture, the API in a documented way, combined with the transparency of the attestation that the consumer of something has to attestate what it is using it for, and maybe an AI layer that could test ongoing my attestation. So something like the vendor has to kind of give it in a structural way that it's computable. The consumer has to use it in a transparent and declared way. And there is an entity that kind of keep us all bounded to what we declared.
Excellent. Joe?
Okay. Maybe, from someone that deploys technology and think about complexity, I think maybe it's a good way to kind of continue to simplify and don't let all the, FUD and, the rat race of constantly trying to add more complexity to the environment. If you've got some working decently well for your most critical pieces, maybe it's okay to let it be. And innovate and evolve in places where it makes sense. And as all of us provide technology to folks that are, their role job is really keeping their business going. So like I think we also have a responsibility to kind of think about that and instead of kind of creating more complexity and be able to meet customers where they are and also be able to anticipate for the future needs. Combination of both, I think we might stand a better chance of not just creating more green field for the attackers, and also be able to anticipate some of the things that may happen.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And Jaya?
Yeah, so I think, like we've said this, there's complexity. It's there. We have to kind of deal with it. It's there from the outside when we look at attackers and new technology, but it's also there on the inside of our networks and products and solutions. So I think like if we try to do one thing, it's to better understand the nature of the complexity. So we can begin by like doing the very unsexy thing of understanding our networks and our own products inside, like from a CISO perspective, and then doing that vendor supply chain management understanding that we've been trying to do for a while. That I really do think that we can actually bring it down just by creating this know thyself phenomenon and making that much more visible and understandable. And again, I'm just thinking as a CISO, but I think like since we're on the hook for actually getting security right, it's okay to say no a bit more often.
Excellent. Well, I mean, as an old Office of Management and Budget analyst, no is a great word. We're from OMB and we're here to help. Sort of that old idea. But I think just to kind of bring it all together, we've heard a number of different themes, and one of the ones that I think is very interesting to me is that I think one of the antidotes to some of the complexity we've been talking about is transparency. The sort of being able to see and to understand, and that a lot of what we're actually doing is sort of the complexity is being generated by kind of the fog of IT and other things. And a lot of what we're talking about is reducing that. And that by enhancing the transparency, we actually have a much better understanding of our environment and can deal with it much better. And so I think that's an interesting lesson to sort of take away from this discussion. So I really want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us on this webinar today, and really appreciate all of your insights. And of course, really appreciate the discussion. It's always fun to get together and talk about these kinds of things. So with that, I will conclude our discussion today, and thank you very much.